Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode, whether you're watching or listening. And with me today, I have Kristen Brun Sharkey, and I'm going to tell you all about her and what we are going to talk about. But just so you know, this is probably one of the first episodes in 2025, and we have a ton of amazing guests coming out this year. So depending on when this episode airs, which I think it is 2025, just know that there is so much in store for you and so much to look forward to. So without further ado, let me introduce Kristen to all of you. So again, Kristen Brun Sharkey is an executive coach, facilitator, and speaker who previously spent 15 years leading teams in advertising, tech, and marketing at companies ranging from early stage startups to Fortune 100s. Today, she helps leaders advance their careers, make better decisions, execute change effectively, develop innovative solutions, and successfully engage their teams. Her unique approach combines evidence-based business and leadership frameworks with principles and skills from improv theater in order to help her clients and audiences accelerate their impact. She has a master's degree in management, strategy, and leadership from Michigan State University and has spoken at notable conferences such as the California Conference for Women and the Chief in Tech Summit. She also co-hosts the leadership podcast, Love and Leadership, which can be found on all major podcast platforms and, of course, in the show notes where we link everything and anything. Kristen, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Amazing. Of course. And I have to say, I really envy your background. For those watching on YouTube or Spotify, Kristen has a really nice background, which is perfect for a podcast setup compared to mine, which is basically just all doors. Like I have a million doors behind me. I'm in a room of doors. I love it.
I had fun designing it.
Oh my gosh. I love it. I'll have to talk to you when we finally are in a home and not a rental apartment, and then we can design anything we want. And nevertheless, this week we're going to talk a lot about innovation and innovation in business, and I'm excited because this is a topic that I've probably broached on the podcast in a few different ways, but not necessarily in an episode on its own. So why don't we first talk about what innovation is and what it means and why maybe it's so important in business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I actually have a model I like to use for this for talking about particularly like how do you build a culture of innovation, because that's such a huge part of it, right? Like innovation isn't just one thing that comes up, like one spark of creativity or one thing. Like really, for companies to truly be innovative, it needs to be embedded into their culture. So I like to think of it as two different dimensions, right? So the first one being the level of commitment in the organization and among the employees. So how committed are people to having a culture of innovation? How committed are people to their ideas, to execution? How engaged are they? And then the other one being openness to new ideas. And I find that those two dimensions are really essential for building that, because if you have high commitment but low openness to ideas, you tend to end up with this more like culture of rigidity, like a lot of the language, like, well, that's just how we do things around here. And if you have a lot of openness to new ideas, but not really the level of commitment and engagement and execution in there, you tend to just kind of get more of the chaos where there's a lot of ideas and creativity happening, but it's not actually being carried out. So the combination of those two, I like to talk about when thinking about like what actually leads to innovation and an ongoing culture of innovation.
I love that. And actually, this conversation is really timely because at the time that we're recording this, which is in the end of November, I'm doing a talk for a women's networking group for a number of women that are part of portfolio companies for this private equity firm. And a friend of mine is an HR leader at one of those companies. And she invited me to talk at the women's networking group. And the topic is actually building a culture of innovation. So this is a very, very timely discussion. And one of the things that I plan to touch on too is that something very similar to what you've just shared, that being open to new ideas, as you've said, and being open to making mistakes and feeling safe in making those mistakes is a huge factor in this. So maybe we dive a little bit deeper, especially following your rubric for building an innovative culture. When you think about those two parameters, again, looking at your rubric, how does someone listening to this podcast episode walk away with a better understanding of how to actually implement those things, where they're building ownership, creating ownership, and then also allowing for those ideas to take place and feeling like they are safe, in a safe place to be able to share ideas?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I love integrating principles from improv theater into many topics, but this is one of my absolute favorites because it applies so well. And yeah, as you said, having an environment where failure is safe is absolutely critical, because if people do not feel safe to make mistakes, then they're not going to raise ideas. They're not going to be in an optimal environment for coming up with new ideas. And they're definitely not going to be in an optimal environment for raising those ideas and bringing them forward. So having that culture where failure is destigmatized is so essential. Like, I always love to quote Brene Brown with, like, there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period. And
True.
Because everything's better when Brene Brown has said it, right? So
Totally. I know, she's a great mind of our present day. Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it too. And to your point, like, whenever she says something, it's really said in such a way that's so clear and direct and kind. And I think about failure often because sometimes I'm like, oh, if someone ever asks me an example of when I failed, it's like, there are examples that I think of, but the ones that come to mind are when I was innovating or trying something or building something new. I mean, you have your own business, I have my own business, and inevitably that is built on the backs of innovation, because you're building something primarily from scratch, and you're seeing, you're throwing spaghetti noodles at the wall, and you're seeing what sticks. And that's kind of like a visual for innovation. When you, to your point, and to Brene Brown's point too, when you are innovating, you have to, you inevitably are going to fail. And I think people see this term failure as like this big bad wolf, and something that they constantly try to avoid. But it's actually failure that teaches us what success is. And it's failure that teaches us how we need to pivot, or ways in which we pivot, in order to find that success. And all of this to say, and I certainly don't want to ramble on and on and on and on, because I want to hear from you, but all of this to say is that when we do make mistakes and we are innovating, it's something that you can feel. Like, you can feel when you have the opportunity and the place and the space to innovate, to make mistakes, to fail, without that fear of reprisal, or the fear that, I don't know, in very realistic terms, that someone's going to get fired or reprimanded for the mistake that they make. So I guess, on that note, with the companies that you've worked with, and especially with your love for improv theater, have you seen cultures where mistakes are not okay? And have you had to, or have you leveraged some of the tools in your tool belt to try and initiate change amongst that culture, or within that culture?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's funny too, because there's always what a company says, and then there's what is the reality of it, right? Totally. Like, what is actually enforced via, like, what's recognized, what's what is promoted, what's tolerated, right? Like that sends different messages. So a lot of times companies are like, we want this is innovative and safe, but then if you're reprimanding people for taking risks, and if you're promoting people who are just playing by the rule book and not going above and beyond and really stepping outside, then that's the message you're sending, right? It's not what you're saying ultimately. Right. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that help with this. One of the first things I usually work with companies to understand is the importance of separating the process of idea generation versus the evaluative part of it. So there's two different types of thinking. There's divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And divergent thinking is the generative part. That's when you're actually coming up with new ideas and generating like different options and possibilities and solutions. And the convergent thinking is when you're actually narrowing down those ideas. You're analyzing them, evaluating them, figuring out like what is the best solution. And what too often happens in companies is they try to do these both at the same time, or they just skip over the generative part right. entirely, right? Just go straight to evaluative. And you miss that critical part of actually coming up with the creative solutions in the first place. But you also miss the opportunity to create this really like safe space for idea generation where people feel like they can speak up. And with improv, this is where bringing in the concept of yes and, which if people have heard of improv, it's very likely they've heard of yes and, but if you're not familiar, it is basically the core of improv. So there's two words. There's the yes, which is agreement and validation. So you're taking the idea that the person has put forth and you're validating it, you're agreeing with it. And then there's the and, which is you're adding your own contribution to it. And this combination like really works so well when it comes to coming up with the ideas and when you're in that generative space, and separating that from the, okay, now let's actually evaluate, analyze, and figure out like what is the best solution here is so powerful.
It's so true. This, it's really funny. This is also part of this presentation that I'm doing at this networking group. And it just goes to show you how there are very applicable, real solutions for people to leverage in order to drive more cohesion and innovation and collaboration. So I love that you brought up yes and, I should say yes and, by the way. But it's something like that I have found has come up recently, even in my like day job, let's say, quote unquote, where I work for a tech company. And, you know, we talk about yes and a lot because there is, while it supports innovation, and being in a tech company, as you know, innovation is kind of like the ethos of everything that happens in order to drive progress. However, you know, when we think of yes and as an approach to communication and all of this, it really does help to foster more innovation. It helps to foster more collaboration and a moving away from what you called a more rigid approach, really to I guess it's kind of like interaction with one another, and the culture of a business. And there is actually a TED Talk. I should probably link it. There's a TED Talk that I recently found in doing some research for this networking group that I'm speaking at, where this person who's not in HR, not in not in a position where she's like coaching teams, from at least from what I saw at that time, and she was talking about how the yes and approach, which I learned from that TED Talk, came from improv. I did not know that before, and I obviously have now reiterated this in my mind from what you've shared. She talked about how it completely transformed the way that she led her team. And so when I think about like non-HR people or those who are not in your profession or in your industry, how they can benefit from taking an approach like using yes and to foster more ideas or the sharing of new ideas, creating psychological safety amongst their team, all of that really goes so far, and all it requires are two words. I mean, I think it's so fundamental when we think about how some of these solutions are some of the simplest. It's like the way that you interact with people, the way that you prevent yourself from chopping down the tree? Because I'm sure you've also, don't let me presume here, but I'm sure you've worked with leaders who would rather just say, no, we're doing it this way, or no, we're doing it that way, because that's their idea and that's what they want to do, instead of taking an approach like yes and my as you were sharing the beauty of improv theater and how we can leverage some of these tools and tactics, I was thinking about Blockbuster, actually. And I think also I was thinking about this because I'm rewatching Schitt's Creek for like the fourth time. And of course, with like Rose Video, it's like top of mind because it's and so I was thinking about how innovation was probably not part of Blockbuster's culture, because had it been, maybe Blockbuster would still be around, and maybe in a different capacity, but maybe they would still be around, right? So another very real example of the difference between an innovative culture and one that is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a certain degree of humility that is required to truly have innovation built into your culture. And I think so many leaders, and there's so many things that relate to this, right? Like a lot of this comes to even down to your childhood insecurities or just how our brains are wired, right? But like so many leaders have a hard time letting go and not being the smartest person in the room or not having the best idea in the room. And it can be really difficult because when they're not open to new ideas, and especially things like, oh yeah, there is this massive change happening in your industry that is going to take out your entire company if you don't do something about it. Like in the classic cases of Blockbuster, like Kodak. It's like another one, right? If you don't have that openness and willingness to see and do things differently, and also the willingness to accept that like what's worked for you in the past and what has come from you as a leader is not going to necessarily work in the future, you're going to be vulnerable to these kind of situations. And it does, I think that like as for leaders, it takes a lot of self-work to be able to do that successfully. But if you go back to I love saying this, and my husband and I have our podcast, Love and Leadership. We reference this all the time as kind of like one of like the raison d'etre for our podcast is like great leaders create more leaders. And if you think about it in that way, like how can you elevate the ideas and solutions of other people, then that's when it's going to really help with creating this more innovative culture altogether.
Yeah, I love that. Great leaders create more leaders. And isn't it so true when we think about even our own experiences with leaders who are amazing, or great in this case? Maybe they're not even amazing. Maybe they're great and great plus. Those are the people that we really emulate. Those are the people we want to work for, and that we want to I guess emulate is really the right word, but borrow from. It's like you've finally become a leader, or I am a firm believer that even people who are individual contributors are leaders too. But still, if we really think about someone managing a team, when you have a great leader, you have something serving as an example for you. Even if someone's like an athlete in high school, I mean, there actually is a pretty sizable population of my listeners who are not in college yet. And so I think about, well, if they're in high school or they're younger and they're on a sports team, or they're part of a club at school, and they have a coach or a mentor or someone who's guiding them through an experience, and they're really amazing at what they do, that helps set people up for success later on in life. And the inverse to that is if they have someone who is not such a great example of leadership, it might deter them from reaching that potential for themselves. There's so much responsibility when it comes to being a leader in title, so to speak, because again, you can be a leader without it. But I I really love that you and your husband say that. I know I said this when we spoke the last time, but I really love that you and your husband do your podcast together, because that in and of itself means that you are extremely open. And you are willing to hear it all. I don't know if I could do that with my husband, because I kind of like having my own thing, but I think that's awesome. It's so awesome.
It's a
Kudos
lot
to
of
you.
fun. It really is.
That's awesome. No, I think it's great. And then it's like you can really hold one another accountable to your various parts of the podcast business, because it certainly requires a lot. That's nice. I think it's really nice, very heartwarming. All of that to say, when I do think about what we've reflected on here and seeing, and I think you said it perfectly, bringing humility into this, that it requires a great deal of humility in order to be innovative or foster an innovative environment. It's really perfectly said in that way, because it's not easy to realize that you are not the one with the best ideas, or that there might be a better idea amongst the group of people that you're interacting with. And that's where great leaders are made. Like when we think about the quote that you and your husband hold on to and feel really strongly about, great leaders are also made when they realize that people around them might contribute better or more, when they sit back and don't share their own ideas, let alone have the idea that sticks. And I don't know, I'm finding myself reflecting on leaders that I've had who have done a really good job of just trusting in and amplifying the voices of the people around them, whether they're on their teams or not. Yeah, I'm reflecting. I
Yeah,
love that.
I have some great examples, and don't get me wrong, you can also learn a lot from the not great leaders in your career.
Yes.
It's also valuable to know what you don't want to do, right? But
Mm.
but yeah, when I really think about, there's a certain degree, there's almost a leap of faith, and you have to be kind of let go of your ego
Mm.
and just really focus on the success of the team and organization and elevating the contributions of others. Like that is how the best leaders are successful, is by doing that. And that is how you get a culture that really values innovation,
Yeah.
is by creating that kind of environment.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I love that. When you work with people who are maybe not so keen on swallowing their pride and relieving themselves of their ego and their tight grip on their ego, and maybe they lack a little bit of humility, how do you approach influencing them to take a different approach, let's say? Because certainly you can influence, but you can't necessarily control the ways in which they interact, either in that present moment or in the future. And I ask this because, of course, with the listeners on the majority being in an HR role or some sort of leadership role, there's always value in the tactical and how they can approach these things, because inevitably we know there's a strong likelihood that more than one person listening to this episode is thinking of that one person in their
Yes.
business who is very difficult with this.
Yeah. And that's reality, right? Like you have some people, even as an executive coach working with an organization, you're going to have some people who come in and they're like, I'm going to take advantage of this. I'm so ready to hear it all. And you're going to have some people who have more movement to go in terms of like coachability and willingness to see and work on issues, right? I think feedback is the most powerful thing in these situations. And I think the framing of the feedback with like working with like a third party, whether it's through someone in HR or through a coach or somebody who can really help you understand that feedback, is especially powerful. But I mean, I actually added to the variety of tools I use, I added an assessment recently from a company called Genos, which is an emotional intelligence assessment that it also has a 360 version of it. Because I think, say for leaders who have challenges in certain areas of emotional intelligence, the feedback from other people is so valuable, and seeing it in a way where you can actually see what the patterns and trends are can really help open somebody's eyes up to it, and presenting it in a way that is helpful and constructive is also a big piece of that. So that's usually my number one thing, is sometimes when somebody is not open to changing, they need to see it in a different way. And like feedback is the most powerful way to do that.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I love that there's also this reality that people can totally outsource that, the way in which that feedback is delivered to someone. This is to me is really the beauty of an executive coach. You bring them on, they're not a part of the organization. They sell it to them straight. It's like,
Yep.
you need to do these things differently, and here are all the reasons why, and here's how you do those things differently. And there isn't any relationship breakdown in the delivery of feedback, because of course, like, I agree with you. This is exactly what feedback is for. If not, these other examples that we could use for where feedback can influence change. But sometimes it can be really difficult to be within the organization or within the team delivering that feedback. And there, unfortunately can be a degradation of relationships. Not to say it happens all the time. And certainly that's not a reason to avoid giving feedback. But I at least have found that, especially with those who maybe are a little bit less willing to change, not necessarily open to change, but willing to change, or think that they don't have anything they need to change, are sometimes best suited for working with a coach who can really get them to that next level, because it's not necessarily the case that they are underperformers or that they're bad leaders. It just might be that they need to see themselves in a different light, to your point.
Yeah.
And
or
please.
they've one area or one particular, a couple of different behaviors that are holding them back. And
right.
that's
And it's like
where
fine tuning those things that can really make a huge difference for the organization on the whole. I mean,
absolutely.
Right. I love that. I think one final thought here is going back to what we talked about sort of at the beginning, that, this driving this culture of innovation really enables the best of people to kind of come out, and that there's this importance in driving innovation and seeing innovation as a part of a culture in order to achieve, even more as a team. And I guess really my final question for you is, when you work with companies who have this innovative culture, or where innovation is embedded within the culture, what are some of the behaviors that you see either celebrated or that you see as being a regular part of people's interactions with one another, or, the business itself?
Yeah, I love this question.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think there's a few things that come to mind. I think part of it is having some kind of celebration of failure is a really powerful thing that can be integrated. And a lot of, like, when we're talking about culture, I think it's important to talk about, like, what are behaviors, rituals, norms, and things that you see that are representative of the culture. So there's different ways to do it. And sometimes it's just as simple as like a leader starting with, like, here was my biggest screw up from this month and here what I learned about it. What was yours? Right. So like having something in there that really like destigmatizes failure and recognizes it as something that is normal. I think having a really sacred process for how idea generation happens that is specific to the company, that is like representative of their culture and is really enforced within those rules and restrictions of it, where you're like, we are not going into the evaluative part of this. We're not going into the convergent thinking, right? Like, this is a space just for generation and for imagining, like, what if, and really holding to that within the company. And then I think also just really embracing play in some degree, which doesn't necessarily, I also come from a tech background. People always imagine like the Silicon Valley foosball tables and stuff. Like there's a lot of ways to integrate play within a culture, but it is something that is so undervalued as adults. And I think you said, like, earlier in our conversation, some of this comes back to like the simplest things, like also like valuing play and going back to like who we are as children also really feeds into that. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that within a culture.
I love that. Thank you so much. I think the listeners hopefully are walking away with a lot of tangible ideas and things that they can either implement or celebrate. You know, we talked a lot about behaviors today, and I think the best way to see more of the behaviors that we want is to your point, celebrate those things and recognize and reward the behaviors you want to see and not the ones you don't. And when we think about like our childhoods and play and all of that, a big part of leading a team is also knowing what to reward and recognize and what not to reward and recognize. And I'm certainly not comparing adults to children, but it's kind of the same as when you're raising kids. It's like, you know, if one child hits the other, like you're not going to really want to have this huge reaction because, especially depending on their age, they might see that as something that they want to continue to get out of you. And so, you know, rewarding the right things is a very specific anecdote, but rewarding the
I love
right
it.
things is the way to go. And I think that that's amazing advice. So Kristen, thank you so much. And aside from the listeners tuning into your podcast, yours and your husband's podcast, where else can they hear from you? And even aside, please plug your podcast as well, because it's a great one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, as we talked about, the podcast is called Love and Leadership. It's on all the major platforms, including wherever you're listening to this, I'm sure. And I am most active on LinkedIn. So Kristen Brun Sharkey, I'm the only one with that combination of names. You can find me pretty easily. And I also, if you're interested in learning more about any of the work that I do, my company website is Emboldify.com.
Amazing. Kristen, thank you so much. This was an amazing discussion. And I think everything that you've shared with the listeners today hopefully will land as something that they can either think about, challenge within their own teams, or bring to their own teams. So thank you so much again.
Thank you. I love this conversation. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.